Welcome back to our daily walk through the scripture for February the 16th. Our readings today are going to take us into Leviticus. We're going to read the first 3 chapters of Leviticus. We're going to finish out Mark chapter 1 and go into the first 12 verses of Mark chapter 12. Excerpt from Psalm 35, finishing it out, and then Proverbs chapter 9, verses 13 through 18. Now, yesterday we gave a little bit of an introduction to the book of Mark, and today it's only appropriate, since we're getting into Leviticus, that we spend a moment talking about Leviticus. Now, Leviticus begins it's like the middle of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also known as the Torah, also known as the Jewish law. When you see it in the Bible, sometimes it'll also be referenced as the law. Really, Leviticus kind of kicks off that part of it. Up till now in Genesis and Exodus, we've kind of had a bit of a narrative story where we've learned about the creation of the world all the way up through Noah's encounter, through Abraham and his offspring, and we finally get over to Joseph moving over to Egypt, which then kicks off Exodus, and we have the story of Moses and the Israelites as they leave Egypt. And so now we enter into Leviticus. And Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are really the books that carry out God's prescribed laws and God's prescribed commands to the people of Israel. Now, it's funny, I was reading about this actually, that there are some scholars that argue that these 3 books of the Bible wouldn't have existed if the people of Israel hadn't decided to do the whole golden calf thing. If you remember, just a few days ago, we talked about the golden calf and the people of Israel getting bored and deciding they wanted to create their own set of rules. All the while, Moses, ironically enough, was going up and getting what we now know are the 10 Commandments and some other edicts and rules, but they weren't nearly the detail that we see here in Leviticus and Numbers and in Deuteronomy. I don't know whether that's true or not. God doesn't do anything by accident. God knows our hearts. So I have a feeling that these 3 books would have happened regardless of the golden calf scene. But what we see here in the book of Leviticus is really the kickoff of a very fancy word. It is the Caesarean Vassal Treaty. Now, Caesarean and vassal, those are 2 really fancy words. Basically, it just means a high king and a lower ruler or a state or something like that. So Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are kind of a treaty between the high king, who is God, and the lesser people, who are Israel. And what you're seeing here in Leviticus specifically are how the vassal, how the lower people, the people of Israel, are to treat and behave to the high king, and Yahweh in this case. And this is not an unknown thing during these times. If you go back into the book of Genesis, you actually see Abraham paying tribute to Melchizedek. This is kind of a Caesarean vassal type deal, or when Abraham goes to the king of Egypt and they pay tribute. That was often some things that you did. So in this case, God is setting up this relationship so that the people of Israel understand who he is and who they are in relation to him. And God is then going to create a series of rules that we're going to walk through that are going to set them aside from all of the other nations and peoples around them. You see, some of the customs and the things that we're going to read about, sacrifices and all that stuff, were an understood part of the culture of the day. People sacrificed to little g gods all of the time. And what God was trying to do in setting out these rules, we look at these rules and we think, man, some of these rules are pretty harsh and pretty cruel. In actuality, compared to the laws and the rules of that day, they were quite graceful and significantly less. Remember, we're talking about cultures that had child sacrifices, that really treated women terribly and horribly. And so when you look at this and you think, man, God really kind of gives some rules about women and such, what God is actually doing is he's setting up protections for women. And he's actually also lessening the harshness and the treatment that women received back in the day, because they were not seen as anything more than just property. And God actually elevates women and children in these laws. And so as we read these things, we see it kick off in Leviticus with 3 types of offerings, and God gives very specific rules when it comes to the offerings. Because again, they were going to, more than likely, the people of Israel were going to follow what everybody else did, hence the golden calf thing. And so God said, no, we're not going to do that. It's time to set it out. And so he gives rules for the burnt offering, He gives rules for the grain offering, and then he also gives rules for the fellowship offering. And each one of these is a standard that is being set for the Caesarean vassal treaty. Okay, so that's kind of our introduction to Leviticus, and tomorrow we'll start digging into that a little bit, and we'll continue to see more of Jesus as the suffering servant in Mark chapter 2. He did some pretty great miracles today showing his servant heart, and more of them will come tomorrow. Have a blessed one. We'll talk soon.